You never even looked at me. You decided I was ugly the moment you saw me." The words echoed through the quiet hallway of a $40 million penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle. Magnus Pini stood frozen. For weeks he had believed his arranged marriage was a mistake forced on him by an old man who refused to let go of control. The bride his grandfather chose had seemed plain, awkward, and completely out of place in the life of one of the youngest billionaire CEOs in America. But now the woman standing in front of him slowly removed her thick glasses. Then she wiped away the heavy makeup. Magnus blinked. His heart pounded. The woman he married looked nothing like the woman he thought he knew. Her long dark hair fell across her shoulders. Her posture carried calm confidence. Her eyes held a quiet strength that made Magnus feel suddenly small. And for the first time since their wedding day, Magnus realized something that sent a wave of regret through his chest. His wife was stunning, but the damage was already done. Carly folded her arms and stared directly at him. "You judged me the second you saw me," she said quietly. "You didn't ask who I was. You didn't try to know me." Magnus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because she was right. From the moment they met, he had decided she was beneath him. The billionaire who ran a multi-billion-dollar technology empire had looked at his own bride and dismissed her in seconds. Now the truth stood in front of him, and Magnus realized he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. But before we continue this story, tell me something in the comments. If someone judged you without even knowing you, would you forgive them? And if you enjoy powerful stories about love, pride, and second chances, take a moment to like this video. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, let's go back to the moment when all of this began. Long before Magnus Pini realized the woman he underestimated would become the one person capable of changing his life forever. Long before the confrontation inside the penthouse hallway, Magnus Pini was known across the American technology industry as one of the most disciplined young executives in the country. At 32 years old, Magnus served as the chief executive officer of Pini Systems, a Seattle-based technology logistics company valued in the billions. Business journals praised his strategy. Investors praised his discipline. Employees respected him, though many feared him. Magnus believed success came from control, structure, and clear decisions. In his world, there was no room for hesitation. Every meeting moved quickly. Every negotiation ended with a winner and a loser. And Magnus rarely lost. Inside the glass headquarters of Pini Systems overlooking Elliott Bay, Magnus began most mornings before sunrise. His assistants arrived at 7. Magnus had already finished reviewing financial reports by then. Numbers made sense to him. People were more complicated. His colleagues often described him with the same words: focused, precise, unemotional. Magnus did not mind the description. To him, emotion interfered with judgment. His leadership style reflected that belief. Executives who failed to meet targets were replaced quickly. Partners who broke agreements were removed from contracts immediately. Magnus believed discipline created stability. That mindset helped him turn the company into one of the fastest-growing technology logistics firms in the United States. But the same mindset shaped something else about Magnus, the way he judged people. Magnus formed opinions quickly. A person's appearance, posture, and confidence often determined how seriously he took them. In business meetings, he could assess someone within seconds. And most of the time, his instincts proved correct. At least that was what Magnus believed. The young billionaire had built his empire by trusting his judgment. He trusted it so strongly that he rarely questioned it. Magnus Pini believed he understood people the moment he saw them. Soon he would learn how wrong that belief could be. While Magnus controlled the daily operations of Pini Systems, the true authority behind the empire belonged to another man. His grandfather, Conrad Pini. Conrad Pini had built the original foundation of the family fortune decades earlier. Long before Magnus entered the technology industry, Conrad had already established himself as a respected investor and business strategist across the Pacific Northwest. Though retired from daily operations, Conrad still controlled the family trust that held majority ownership of Pini Systems. That detail mattered. Without Conrad's trust, Magnus would not control the company. Most people in the business community knew Conrad as a calm and thoughtful figure who rarely spoke without purpose. Magnus knew another side of him. Conrad watched people carefully. He studied character the way Magnus studied financial charts. On several occasions, Conrad had warned Magnus about one particular weakness. "You judge too quickly," Conrad once told him during a private dinner. Magnus had responded with quiet confidence. Quick decisions built this company. Conrad nodded slowly, but did not argue further. Still, he observed. During board meetings, Conrad noticed how Magnus evaluated new partners. He saw how Magnus dismissed individuals who did not fit his expectations. To Magnus, these were efficient decisions. To Conrad, they revealed something troubling, a lack of empathy. Conrad believed leadership required more than intelligence and discipline. A leader needed the ability to understand people. Magnus possessed many strengths. He worked harder than most executives twice his age. He protected the company from reckless investments and dangerous partnerships. But Conrad feared Magnus had built emotional walls that prevented him from truly understanding others. And if that weakness continued, Conrad believed it could damage not only Magnus's personal life, but also the future of the company itself. So Conrad began considering a solution, one that would force Magnus to confront the part of himself he had spent years ignoring. A solution Magnus would never expect. One quiet afternoon, Magnus received a message from his grandfather requesting a meeting. Not at the company headquarters, at the Peony estate outside Seattle. The estate stood on several acres of forested land overlooking Lake Washington. The house had belonged to the family for generations. Magnus arrived expecting a brief conversation about company strategy. Instead, Conrad guided him into the private study where many of the family's most serious decisions had been made. The room felt quiet and deliberate. Conrad sat behind a large wooden desk and opened a folder. "There is something about the family trust you need to understand," Conrad said. Magnus leaned back in the chair across from him. "I already understand the trust." Conrad shook his head slightly. Not completely. He slid a document across the desk. Magnus scanned the page. Then he looked up. "You're serious?" Conrad's voice remained calm. "Very." The document revealed a condition tied to the inheritance structure of the family trust. If Magnus wanted full control of Peony Systems, he would need to fulfill a specific requirement. Within 6 months, Magnus had to marry. Magnus stared at his grandfather in disbelief. "This is ridiculous." Conrad folded his hands calmly. The condition was written years ago. Magnus pushed the document across the desk. "You expect me to choose a wife like I'm signing a business contract?" Conrad studied him quietly. "I expect you to learn something you have avoided your entire life." Magnus did not appreciate the tone. "I built the company you're trying to control." Conrad responded without raising his voice. "You built it with the resources this family provided." The room fell silent. Magnus understood one thing clearly. This condition was not a suggestion. It was a requirement. Magnus stood from the chair and paced slowly across the study. "Marriage has nothing to do with running a technology company," he said firmly. Conrad remained seated. "It has everything to do with understanding people." Magnus turned toward him. "I understand people perfectly well." Conrad did not argue. He simply waited. Magnus stopped near the window overlooking the lake. "This condition is unnecessary," he said. "Remove it." Conrad shook his head. "The trust cannot be changed." Magnus felt frustration building. "You're willing to risk the company over this?" Conrad's expression remained steady. "If you refuse the condition, the trust transfers control of Peony Systems to the board until a successor is chosen." Magnus turned back sharply. "You would hand the company to the board?" "Yes." The response came without hesitation. Magnus knew the board well enough to understand the consequences. Several investors had already questioned his aggressive leadership style. If they gained control, Magnus could lose his position as chief executive. Years of work could disappear in a single vote. Magnus stared at the document on the desk again. 6 months. That was the deadline written in the trust. 6 months to marry. Magnus exhaled slowly. This is manipulation. Conrad looked at him carefully. No, he said quietly. It is a lesson. Magnus did not believe that. To him, the condition felt like an unnecessary obstacle placed in his path by an older man who refused to let him lead without interference. But the numbers were clear. Without fulfilling the requirement, Magnus could lose the company he spent years building. And Magnus Peony did not lose control easily. He left the estate that afternoon with anger simmering beneath his calm expression. For the first time in his career, Magnus faced a problem he could not solve with negotiation or strategy. The solution required something he had never planned to do: marry someone he did not love. And that decision would soon introduce him to the woman who would challenge everything he believed about people. While Magnus managed billion-dollar contracts inside glass towers in downtown Seattle, another life moved quietly across the city. Inside a modest children's learning center funded by the Peony Foundation, Carly Williams spent her mornings surrounded by children who ran through the halls with backpacks and bright laughter. Most people inside the building simply knew her as Carly, the calm nanny who seemed to understand children better than anyone else. She arrived early each morning before the first students entered the classrooms. Some children came from difficult homes. Others had parents who worked long hours and needed safe places for their kids during the day. Carly greeted each child the same way: a warm smile, a patient voice, and a steady presence that made nervous children relax within minutes. She organized reading activities, helped with homework, prepared snacks when the younger children grew restless. When disagreements started between the kids, Carly never raised her voice. She listened. Then she helped them solve the problem. Many of the foundation volunteers admired her calm approach. Some assumed she studied child psychology or education. Carly rarely spoke about her past. She preferred to focus on the children instead. But those who worked closely with her noticed something unusual. Despite her simple job title, Carly carried herself with quiet confidence. She read books during her lunch breaks. Not novels or entertainment. Financial books, business articles, economic reports. One volunteer once asked her about it. Carly smiled gently. "I like understanding how systems work," she said. The answer surprised them. A nanny studying business strategies. Yet, Carly never tried to impress anyone with knowledge. She continued doing the same quiet work every day, helping children learn, helping them feel safe, helping them believe their future could be bigger than their circumstances. Few people realized the foundation she worked for belonged to one of the most powerful business families in Seattle. And even fewer realized that someone very important had been watching Carly for quite some time. Carly Williams learned responsibility long before adulthood. She grew up in a small apartment outside Tacoma with 3 younger siblings. Life in that neighborhood required maturity at an early age. Their mother worked long hours at a hospital cafeteria. Their father left when Carly was 12. From that moment, Carly quietly stepped into a role no teenager should have to carry. Caretaker. She helped her siblings with homework, prepared meals when their mother worked late shifts, managed grocery budgets carefully so food lasted through the week. Many evenings Carly stayed awake after everyone slept, studying, planning, thinking about ways to change their future. She never wanted her siblings to feel trapped by the same financial pressure she witnessed growing up. Education became her focus. Scholarships helped her attend community college. Later, she completed courses in non-profit management and child development. But Carly never chased status or recognition. She chose work that mattered to her, helping children, supporting families, giving younger students the encouragement she once needed. The foundation where she worked allowed her to do exactly that. Though the salary was modest, Carly used most of it supporting her siblings as they entered college themselves. She rarely bought expensive clothes, rarely attended social gatherings, rarely spoke about her sacrifices. Responsibility had shaped her personality in quiet ways. Carly valued honesty, she valued independence, and most importantly, she valued dignity. because she had experienced enough hardship to understand one powerful truth: money could change opportunities. But character defined a person. What Carly did not realize was that someone with enormous influence had already noticed those exact qualities in her. Someone who believed she might be the only person capable of teaching Magnus Pini a lesson he desperately needed. Conrad Pini visited the foundation several times each year. Unlike many wealthy donors who appeared briefly for photographs, Conrad preferred observing quietly from the background. He walked through classrooms, listened to teachers speak with students, studied the structure of the programs his funding supported, and during those visits, one particular employee consistently caught his attention: Carly Williams. At first, Conrad noticed the way children reacted to her presence. Nervous students relaxed when she spoke. Younger kids followed her instructions without hesitation, respect without fear. That quality interested him. During one visit, Conrad remained seated near the back of a reading session. Carly sat on the floor surrounded by children while guiding them through a storybook. Her voice stayed calm and steady. When one child struggled to read a difficult sentence, Carly waited patiently. She never rushed the child. She never corrected harshly. She encouraged, and the child tried again. Conrad watched the entire interaction with thoughtful attention. Later, he asked the program director about her. "Who is that young woman?" Conrad asked. The director smiled. "That's Carly. She's one of the most reliable staff members we have." Conrad asked several more questions. He learned about her work ethic, her support for her siblings, her refusal to seek promotions despite her strong leadership abilities. That detail intrigued him most. A person who avoided recognition often possessed stronger character than those who chased it. Over the next several months, Conrad quietly requested updates about Carly's progress at the foundation. Each report confirmed his impression: discipline, integrity, patience, strength, qualities he wished Magnus understood more deeply. And slowly an idea formed in Conrad's mind. A plan that connected two very different lives: the disciplined billionaire who judged people too quickly, and the quiet woman who had spent her entire life proving strength without demanding attention. Conrad believed their meeting could change everything. For Magnus, and possibly for Carly as well. Several weeks after Magnus left the estate frustrated about the marriage condition, Conrad invited Carly to visit the main house. The message surprised her. Donors rarely ask to meet individual staff members. Still, she accepted politely. The estate felt enormous compared to the small apartment where Carly grew up. Tall windows overlooked the lake. Historic paintings lined the hallway walls. A staff member guided her to Conrad's study. When she entered the room, Conrad greeted her warmly. "Thank you for coming, Carly." She sat carefully across from him. "You said you wanted to discuss something important?" Conrad nodded. "Yes." He explained that he had been observing her work at the foundation. Carly listened quietly, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "You demonstrate discipline and responsibility," Conrad continued. "Qualities that are increasingly rare." Carly thanked him politely, but did not understand where the conversation was leading. Then Conrad placed a document on the desk between them. "What I'm about to suggest will sound unusual," he said calmly. Carly studied him with confusion. Conrad explained the inheritance condition attached to the family trust. Then he explained Magnus, the billionaire grandson who must marry within 6 months to maintain control of his company. Carly stared at him in disbelief. "You're asking me to marry someone I've never met?" Conrad did not rush his response. "Yes." The room grew quiet. Carly's mind filled with questions. Why her? Why such an arrangement? Conrad answered honestly. "I believe you possess the character needed to challenge Magnus," he said. Carly leaned back slowly. "This sounds like a business contract." "In many ways it is," Conrad admitted. But he also explained the financial benefits: security for her future, support for her siblings' education, opportunities to expand the foundation programs she cared about. Carly remained silent for several moments. The proposal felt strange, yet practical. Finally, she spoke. "If I agree," she said carefully, The arrangement stays respectful. Conrad nodded. Always. And with that decision, Carly Williams stepped into an agreement that would soon connect her life to Magnus Pini in a way neither of them could fully predict. After the meeting at the Pini estate, Carly left with a quiet mind filled with questions. The drive back towards Seattle felt longer than usual. She kept thinking about the name Conrad mentioned during their conversation. Magnus Pini. Even though Carly rarely followed Billionaire headlines, she had heard the name before. In Seattle's business circles, Magnus appeared often in articles discussing technology growth and corporate expansion. During one lunch break weeks earlier, another volunteer at the foundation had shown her a news article about him. The youngest CEO running a logistics empire, the article said. Carly remembered glancing at the photograph. Sharp suit, confident posture, eyes that looked focused and distant at the same time. At that moment, she had not expected the man in that article would one day become part of her life. Now Conrad was asking her to marry him, not out of love, not out of friendship, but because of a legal condition tied to a family trust. Carly sat quietly in her apartment that evening reviewing everything Conrad explained. Magnus needed a wife within 6 months. Without marriage, he would lose control of the company he built. The arrangement sounded unusual, yet it was clear Conrad had already considered every detail carefully. Carly also thought about something else, Conrad said. I believe you possess the character needed to challenge Magnus. That sentence stayed in her mind. Carly had spent most of her life avoiding attention and conflict. She preferred solving problems quietly rather than confronting people. So the idea that she might somehow challenge a billionaire CEO felt strange. But the proposal also carried real possibilities. Financial stability, support for her siblings' education, the chance to expand the children's programs she cared about deeply. Still, Carly knew one thing clearly. If she agreed to this arrangement, she needed to understand exactly who Magnus Pini was, and whether the man behind the headlines possessed the character Conrad believed he lacked. That evening, Carly called her younger sister, Maya. They spoke almost every day. When Carly explained Conrad's proposal, the line remained silent for several seconds. Wait, Maya said finally. You're telling me a billionaire wants to marry you because his grandfather told him to? Carly laughed softly. When you say it like that, it sounds even stranger. Maya asked the question Carly had been thinking about herself. Do you trust him? Carly hesitated. I haven't even met him. That alone feels risky, Maya replied. Carly understood the concern. Wealth often came with complicated personalities. She had seen enough examples through charity events and donor visits. Some wealthy individuals treated employees with respect. Others treated them like background furniture. Carly had promised herself long ago that she would never allow anyone to disrespect her dignity. No amount of money could change that. What if he looks down on you? Maya asked tearfully. Carly leaned back against the couch. That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out. Because Carly had spent her life observing people, she knew that the way someone treated others often revealed more than anything they said. Magnus Pini might be successful, he might be intelligent, but Carly needed to know what kind of man he truly was. And if she entered this arrangement, she wanted the truth before trusting him with any part of her life. That thought slowly shaped an idea in her mind. If Magnus judged people quickly, then perhaps she could test that weakness. She could observe how he treated someone he believed had little status. Someone ordinary, someone unimpressive. The plan formed quietly, not out of cruelty, but out of protection. Because Carly had learned something important through years of responsibility. Before trusting someone with your future, you must understand their character. 2 days later, Carly returned to the Pini estate. Conrad welcomed her back into the same quiet study where they first spoke. I assume you've thought about the proposal, Conrad said calmly. Carly nodded. I have. She sat across from him, carefully choosing her words. This arrangement must remain respectful. No one should treat it like a joke or a social experiment. Conrad listened attentively. I agree, Carly continued. And if your grandson decides he dislikes the arrangement, he should be free to say so honestly. Conrad gave a small smile. "I suspect Magnus will express his opinions very clearly." That response made Carly curious. She wondered what kind of personality Magnus truly possessed. Confident, arrogant, reserved? Perhaps a mixture of all three. Carly placed her hands calmly on the desk. "I will agree to the arrangement," she said. Conrad nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected the answer. But Carly raised one additional point. "I want time before the wedding to prepare." "Of course," Conrad said. There were legal documents to review, terms to confirm, privacy agreements to sign. Conrad's legal team handled each detail carefully. The marriage would remain private at first. Only a small group of trusted individuals would attend the ceremony. When Carly finished signing the final document, Conrad looked at her thoughtfully. "You understand that Magnus has not met you yet," he said. Carly nodded. "That might work in my favor." Conrad studied her expression, but did not ask what she meant. Because Carly had already decided something important. Before Magnus learned who she truly was, she would learn who he really was. And the best way to discover that truth would be through observation. Observation without influence. Observation without expectation. Observation while Magnus believed he was seeing her clearly. The irony of that idea almost made Carly smile. Later that week, Carly stood in front of a mirror inside her small apartment bedroom. Clothes lay spread across the bed, loose sweaters, plain skirts, large glasses she had borrowed from a friend. Carly looked at her reflection carefully. Normally she kept her appearance simple but neat. Clean clothing, tied-back hair, minimal makeup. Now she planned something different. If Magnus Penny judged people quickly based on appearance, she wanted to see it happen naturally. Not during a business meeting, not during a formal introduction, but during the moment he first saw his future wife. Carly pulled on an oversized sweater that hid her natural posture. Then she tied her hair into a plain style that removed its usual volume. Next came the makeup. Instead of enhancing her features, she applied it unevenly so her face looked dull and tired. Finally, she placed the thick glasses on her nose. The transformation surprised even her. She no longer looked like the confident woman who managed a classroom full of energetic children. She looked ordinary, almost awkward. Carly studied the mirror again. If Magnus treated her with kindness despite that appearance, she would respect him immediately. But if he dismissed her the moment he saw her, then she would know something important. She would know exactly what kind of man she had agreed to marry. Carly removed the glasses and placed them carefully on the table. The wedding would take place in less than 2 weeks. Magnus Penny would see his bride for the first time. And without realizing it, he would also be taking a test of character he did not even know existed. 2 weeks passed quickly. The wedding day arrived on a cool Seattle morning. A quiet mist floated across the trees surrounding the Penny estate. The ceremony remained private, just as Conrad promised. No press, no large audience. Only a small group of trusted witnesses gathered inside the historic hall of the estate. Magnus arrived first. He walked through the entrance with the same calm confidence that defined every business meeting he attended. His suit was perfectly tailored. His expression carried the controlled focus people expected from the CEO of a billion-dollar company. Yet inside his mind, the situation felt strange. Marriage had never been part of Magnus's plans. He believed relationships complicated decisions. Emotions distracted people from goals. Throughout his career, Magnus avoided commitments that could interfere with his control over life. Now he stood inside a wedding hall preparing to marry someone he had never met. All because of a legal condition inside a family trust. Magnus adjusted his cufflinks and glanced toward his grandfather. Conrad stood calmly near the front of the room, speaking quietly with the officiant. Magnus walked toward him. "This still feels unnecessary," Magnus said. Conrad looked at him with steady eyes. "You will understand the purpose one day." Magnus gave a short nod, but did not continue the argument. He had already studied the documents carefully. Without this marriage, the board could gain control of Penny Systems. That outcome was unacceptable. So Magnus treated the situation like any other strategic decision. Complete the requirement. Maintain control. Move forward. The doors at the back of the hall opened slowly. Magnus turned to see his bride for the first time. And within seconds, he made the same mistake that would later echo through the hallway of his penthouse. Carly stepped into the hall quietly. Her oversized dress hung loosely over her shoulders. The thick glasses rested on her face. Her makeup made her appear pale and tired. She walked calmly down the aisle. Every step felt deliberate. Carly kept her eyes forward, but she could sense Magnus studying her from across the room. She did not need to look up to know his reaction. After years of observing people, Carly had learned to read silence. And Magnus's silence told her everything. When she finally reached the front of the room, she raised her eyes briefly. Their gaze met for the first time. Magnus's expression changed for just a moment. Disappointment. It lasted only a second, but Carly saw it clearly. He recovered quickly, returning to the controlled posture expected from a corporate leader. But the first reaction had already revealed his thoughts. Magnus had judged her, instantly, without knowing her name, without hearing her speak, without understanding anything about the life she built. Carly felt no anger in that moment, only confirmation. Her plan worked. The test had begun. The officiant started the ceremony with calm, formal words. The legal agreement between the two families had already been prepared. This marriage existed as both a personal contract and a business requirement. Magnus repeated the vows without hesitation. His voice remained steady and professional. Carly repeated the vows as well. But inside her mind, she noted every detail of Magnus's behavior. The brief glance he avoided, the distance in his posture, the polite but detached tone in his voice. By the time the officiant declared them married, Carly already understood something important. Magnus Pini had formed an opinion about his wife in less than 10 seconds. The ceremony ended quickly. A few witnesses offered quiet congratulations. Conrad shook Magnus's hand before turning to Carly with a gentle smile. "Welcome to the family," he said. Carly thanked him politely. Magnus stood beside her with the same composed posture he used during board meetings. If someone entered the room without context, they might believe he had just finished signing a business contract. In many ways, that comparison was accurate. After the ceremony, a small lunch was served in a private dining room. Magnus remained courteous but distant. He asked Carly basic questions. "Do you prefer Seattle or Tacoma? Have you worked long at the foundation?" Carly answered calmly but briefly. She did not try to impress him. She did not attempt to change his opinion. That was not the purpose of the test. Throughout the meal, Magnus's attention often drifted toward his phone. A message from his executive assistant appeared on the screen regarding an upcoming investor meeting. Business still occupied most of his focus. Carly noticed that detail as well. Magnus seemed far more comfortable discussing corporate negotiations than speaking with the woman he had just married. When lunch ended, Magnus stood and addressed Carly politely. "Our flight to Seattle leaves within the hour." Carly nodded. The plan was simple. They would move directly into Magnus's penthouse overlooking the city. That space would serve as their shared residence, at least according to the legal arrangement. But Carly suspected the living situation would not feel like a traditional marriage. Magnus had already revealed his priorities, and affection was not one of them. That evening, Magnus and Carly arrived at the towering glass building that held his penthouse residence. The elevator ride remained quiet. Seattle's skylines spread across the windows as the elevator climbed toward the top floors. When the doors opened, Carly stepped into a living space larger than the entire apartment where she grew up. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay. Modern furniture filled the wide living room. Soft lights reflected off polished marble floors. Magnus placed his keys on the table and turned toward her. "There are 2 bedroom suites," he said calmly. He gestured toward a hallway. "The one on the left will be yours." Carly nodded. The words confirmed what she already expected. Magnus did not view this marriage as a relationship. He viewed it as an arrangement. "House staff will assist with anything you need," Magnus continued. His tone sounded professional, almost like he was explaining company policy to a new employee. If you require financial support, my accountant can arrange it. Carly responded simply. That won't be necessary. Magnus looked slightly surprised by the answer, but did not question it. Instead, he added one final statement. I will respect your privacy. I expect the same. Carly nodded again. Of course. Magnus then walked toward his office area, already opening his laptop as if the wedding had simply been another item on his daily schedule. Carly stood quietly in the center of the penthouse for a moment. Her plan had already revealed the first truth. Magnus Pini believed appearances told him everything he needed to know. And because of that belief, he had already dismissed his own wife. What Magnus did not realize was that the test had only just begun. Soon, he would learn how wrong his first impression truly was. The ceremony took place at the original Pini estate, one of the oldest private properties on the eastern side of Seattle. The house stood on a hill overlooking Lake Washington. Tall cedar trees surrounded the property, shielding it from the city beyond. The estate had hosted decades of important family events, but this particular wedding remained intentionally quiet. No reporters waited outside the gates. No public announcements appeared in society columns. Conrad Pini had arranged the ceremony carefully to avoid unnecessary attention. Only a few trusted witnesses attended. 2 legal representatives sat near the front to ensure the marriage agreement met every requirement tied to the family trust. Magnus arrived early. He walked through the tall wooden doors and paused briefly inside the entry hall. The building carried the calm weight of history. Old portraits of previous Pini family members lined the walls, each one representing generations of wealth and influence. Magnus had grown up visiting this estate, but today the house felt different. Today it held a responsibility he had never planned to carry. A wedding. Magnus moved toward the ceremony room where several guests had already gathered. A quiet string quartet played soft background music near the windows. His grandfather stood beside the officiant, reviewing final documents. Everything is ready, Conrad said as Magnus approached. Magnus gave a short nod. He remained calm, though the situation still felt unusual. Most men prepared for weddings after years of relationships and emotional commitment. Magnus stood there preparing to marry a woman he had never met. Still, the purpose remained clear. Fulfill the requirement. Protect the company. Continue leading the empire he spent years building. Magnus checked his watch once more. The ceremony would begin in minutes, and soon the woman chosen by his grandfather would walk through those doors. A quiet signal from the coordinator indicated the ceremony was beginning. Guests turned their attention toward the entrance doors. Magnus stood beside the officiant and faced the aisle. The doors opened slowly. Carly stepped into the room. Her appearance reflected the careful disguise she had prepared days earlier. The dress she wore looked simple and loose compared to the elegant attire typically expected at a wedding within a wealthy family. Her hair appeared plain and tightly styled. Thick glasses covered part of her face. The makeup softened her natural features instead of highlighting them. Carly walked calmly down the aisle. Each step carried quiet confidence, despite the modest appearance she presented. Magnus watched closely. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply observed. But inside his mind, a quick evaluation had already begun. Magnus had spent years analyzing people during negotiations. His instinct often formed immediate impressions based on posture, presentation, and expression. Now that instinct responded automatically. This woman did not match the image he expected. He had imagined someone confident, polished, and socially refined. Instead, he saw someone who appeared plain and unremarkable. Magnus kept his posture steady. No one in the room would easily detect his reaction. But the difference between expectation and reality had already registered clearly in his mind. As Carly reached the front of the room, Magnus finally looked directly at her. For a brief second, his expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. His eyebrows tightened slightly. His eyes narrowed, as if he were trying to confirm what he was seeing. Disappointment crossed his face. The reaction lasted only a moment, yet it revealed more than Magnus intended. He recovered quickly, returning to the calm expression expected from a business leader. But the first reaction had already happened. Magnus had judged his bride. In his mind, the situation felt almost ironic. A billionaire CEO, known for discipline and precision, now stood at the altar beside a woman who seemed completely outside the world he built. The vows began. The officiant spoke clearly while the witnesses listened quietly. Magnus repeated the words exactly as required. His voice remained confident and controlled. Nothing in his tone revealed hesitation. To the guests watching, the ceremony appeared normal. But inside Magnus's thoughts, a different conversation continued. This arrangement existed for legal reasons, not emotional ones. Magnus reminded himself of that fact as the ceremony continued. He did not need affection. He did not need connection. He simply needed to complete the requirement. While Magnus focused on completing the ceremony, Carly paid attention to something else. His reaction. When she first looked up at him near the altar, she saw the change in his face immediately. It was small, quick, but unmistakable. Years of observing people had trained Carly to recognize subtle expressions. She knew the difference between surprise, curiosity, and disappointment. Magnus's expression clearly belonged to the last one. He had already formed an opinion, and Carly understood exactly why. Her disguise had achieved its purpose. Magnus believed he was seeing her true appearance. Yet, despite the judgment she noticed in his expression, Carly showed no reaction. She did not challenge him. She did not defend herself. Instead, she maintained the same calm posture she practiced with the children at the foundation. The vows finished. The officiant spoke the final declaration. By the authority granted to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. A quiet round of polite applause filled the room. Magnus extended his hand slightly, guiding Carly away from the altar as the ceremony ended. To the witnesses present, everything appeared orderly and respectful. But Carly knew something Magnus did not. The test had already produced its first answer. The billionaire who believed he could understand people at a glance had just made his first mistake. And soon, that mistake would begin to challenge everything Magnus believed about himself. That evening, the car carrying Magnus and Carly moved quietly through downtown Seattle. The city lights reflected across the glass towers surrounding the financial district. Traffic slowed near the waterfront as the driver turned toward the building where Magnus lived. The tower stood among the tallest in the city. Private security greeted the car before the gate opened. Within minutes, the vehicle entered an underground garage reserved for residents of the top floors. Magnus stepped out first. Carly followed silently. Neither spoke during the elevator ride. As the elevator rose, the city skyline expanded across the glass walls. Elliott Bay shimmered beneath the fading evening light. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse. Carly stepped into a living space larger than any home she had ever entered. The ceiling stretched high above polished marble floors. Long windows revealed the entire waterfront. Yet despite the beauty of the space, the room felt quiet, almost empty. Magnus removed his jacket and placed it neatly over the back of a chair. "This will be your residence from now on," he said in a calm voice. The statement sounded formal, almost like a business briefing. Carly looked around slowly. The penthouse contained everything a person could need: a modern kitchen, large living room, private gym, library, and 2 separate bedroom suites. But it did not feel like a shared home. It felt like a carefully designed environment where 2 strangers would live separate lives. Magnus walked toward a hallway and gestured calmly. "There are 2 bedroom suites," he said. "The one on the left will be yours." Carly nodded once. She had expected exactly that. The marriage had begun the same way the ceremony ended. Quiet, distant, and completely without affection. Magnus placed a small folder on the kitchen counter. Inside were documents prepared by his legal advisors. "These outline household arrangements," he explained. Carly stepped closer but did not open the folder yet. Magnus continued speaking with the same controlled tone he used during executive meetings. "Staff will handle cleaning and maintenance. Groceries are delivered weekly. If you need transportation, the building concierge can arrange it." Carly listened without interruption. The conversation felt less like newlyweds discussing life together and more like a corporate orientation. Magnus added another point. My schedule requires frequent travel. When that happens, the penthouse will remain available for your use. Carly nodded again. I understand. Magnus studied her briefly. Most people entering this level of wealth reacted with excitement or curiosity. Carly showed neither. She did not ask about spending accounts. She did not ask about luxury events. She did not ask about shopping or travel. Instead, she simply listened. Magnus noticed the difference, but said nothing. He pointed toward the hallway again. The suite includes a private office and balcony. Thank you, Carly replied politely. A quiet pause followed. Finally, Magnus spoke once more. I believe it is important we respect each other's privacy. Carly met his eyes calmly. That works for me. The agreement was simple. Two individuals living under the same roof, bound by a legal marriage, yet emotionally distant. Life inside the penthouse quickly developed a routine. Magnus left early most mornings for the headquarters of Peony Systems. His workdays often stretched long into the evening with meetings, negotiations, and investor calls. Sometimes he returned after midnight. Other nights he traveled to New York, San Francisco, or Chicago for business discussions. Carly's schedule looked entirely different. She continued working at the foundation. Each morning she left the building carrying a simple bag filled with lesson materials for the children she mentored. The building's staff noticed something unusual about her habits. Despite living in one of Seattle's most luxurious residences, Carly lived simply. She prepared her own breakfast. She rarely requested assistance from the house staff. She often spent evenings reading on the balcony rather than attending social gatherings. Magnus occasionally saw her during those quiet moments. Once he walked through the living room late at night and noticed Carly sitting near the window with several books spread across the table. Financial reports, economic journals. Magnus paused briefly. He had expected novels or entertainment magazines. Instead, he saw documents similar to the ones studied by his executive team. He continued walking without commenting. Another evening, he noticed Carly reviewing spreadsheets on a laptop. Again, he said nothing. The marriage continued quietly, two separate lives operating within the same home. As the weeks passed, Magnus began noticing details about Carly that did not match his original assumptions. She never asked him for money. Not once. Most people entering his life showed interest in financial advantages quickly. Carly showed none. She continued working at the foundation despite the fact that she no longer needed the income. Magnus also noticed her discipline. Each evening she studied something. Sometimes non-profit funding structures, sometimes economic policy discussions, sometimes market trends related to education programs. One night, Magnus entered the kitchen late after returning from a long meeting. Carly stood near the counter reviewing a printed article. Magnus glanced at the title. It discussed philanthropic investment strategies. You read financial reports? He asked. Carly looked up calmly. Sometimes. Magnus leaned slightly against the counter. That's unusual for someone working in childcare. Carly smiled lightly. Understanding resources helps programs survive. The answer surprised him. Most people avoided complex financial topics. Carly treated them naturally. Magnus nodded once before leaving the room. But later that night, he found himself thinking about the conversation again. For weeks he had believed his wife was quiet, ordinary, and unremarkable. Now, small details began challenging that assumption. Something about Carly Williams did not match the impression he formed on their wedding day. And slowly, without realizing it, Magnus Peony began paying closer attention to the woman he once dismissed within seconds. Several weeks passed after the wedding, and Carly continued her routine as if her life had not changed at all. Each morning, she left the penthouse shortly after sunrise. While Magnus reviewed investor reports and scheduled meetings, Carly walked through the doors of the Children's Foundation where she had worked long before the marriage. The children greeted her the same way they always had, running toward her with excitement, asking questions about homework, telling her stories about school. To them, Carly was simply the mentor who listened carefully and encouraged them when they struggled. None of the children knew she now lived in one of the most expensive residences in Seattle. And Carly preferred it that way. She never mentioned the marriage. She never mentioned Magnus. Inside the foundation, she remained exactly who she had always been. The calm woman guiding children through reading exercises, helping them solve small problems, and encouraging them to believe in their abilities. But outside the classrooms, other staff members noticed something unusual. Despite her quiet nature, Carly had begun assisting with organizational decisions. When the foundation prepared its quarterly budget report, Carly volunteered to review the financial numbers. She studied funding allocations. She identified small inefficiencies in supply purchasing. She even suggested ways to stretch grant money further so the programs could support more children. The program director listened with interest. "You understand these numbers well," he said. Carly smiled slightly. "I like learning how systems work." Most people assumed she simply enjoyed studying. Only Carly knew the real reason. Understanding systems helped protect the programs she cared about, because if resources were managed wisely, more children could benefit. And although Carly never sought recognition, her quiet competence slowly began attracting attention from someone watching much more closely. One evening, Magnus returned home earlier than usual. A board meeting scheduled for that afternoon had ended faster than expected, leaving him with several quiet hours before another conference call. As he entered the penthouse, he noticed the living room lights were still on. Carly sat at the large dining table with several documents spread around her. Magnus paused briefly. He recognized the papers immediately. Corporate earnings summaries, market trend reports, economic forecasts, documents similar to the material his own executives reviewed daily. Magnus stepped closer. "You follow financial markets?" Carly looked up calmly. "Sometimes." Magnus picked up one of the reports. "This analysis comes from a New York investment group," he said. Carly nodded. "They publish strong data on non-profit funding patterns." Magnus studied her carefully. He had expected his wife to possess basic curiosity, perhaps interest in charity programs or education. But the level of information on the table suggested something deeper. "You study these regularly?" he asked. Carly folded the document neatly. "It helps me understand how funding decisions affect community programs." Magnus nodded slowly. He could not deny the logic. Still, something about the situation felt unusual. Most people he met inside the charity world focused on emotional appeals for donations. Carly approached the work differently. She approached it with analysis. That night, Magnus walked into his office with a new thought forming in his mind. Perhaps his first impression of Carly had not captured the full picture. And for the first time since their wedding, Magnus began to wonder whether there was more to his quiet wife than he originally believed. A few days later, Magnus noticed Carly sitting on the balcony overlooking the water. The evening air carried a light breeze across Elliott Bay. Soft music played from her phone, while she reviewed notes inside a notebook. Magnus stepped outside. "You spend a lot of time studying," he said. Carly closed the notebook gently. "I enjoy learning." Magnus leaned lightly against the railing. "What are you studying tonight?" Carly hesitated briefly before answering. "Investment models used by non-profit organizations." Magnus looked at her with mild surprise. "That's a complex topic." Carly shrugged softly. "It becomes easier when you break it into smaller patterns." Magnus studied her expression. She spoke about financial structures with calm familiarity, not the nervous tone people often used when discussing unfamiliar subjects. "What made you interested in that field?" Magnus asked. Carly answered honestly. "When I was younger, many programs helping children closed because funding disappeared. I wanted to understand why." Magnus nodded slowly. The answer made sense, but it also revealed something about Carly he had not recognized earlier. Her curiosity came from experience, not from ambition or status. Magnus had spent years studying markets because he wanted to build companies. Carly studied them because she wanted to protect children's programs. That difference stayed in Magnus's mind long after the conversation ended. For the first time, he began seeing a dimension of Carly that had remained invisible during their first meeting. And that realization started replacing indifference with curiosity. As the weeks continued, Magnus found himself observing Carly more often. Not intentionally, but naturally. One morning he noticed she prepared breakfast for herself before leaving for the foundation. Another evening, he saw her reading quietly in the library instead of watching television. Once he passed by the kitchen and heard her speaking on the phone with one of her younger siblings, offering encouragement about a college exam. The conversation sounded warm and supportive. Magnus paused briefly in the hallway before continuing toward his office. The small moments revealed a side of Carly he had not expected. Responsibility, patience, discipline, qualities he respected in business leaders. Yet Carly displayed them naturally in everyday life. Magnus realized something else. She never tried to gain his attention. She never asked about his schedule. She never attempted to influence his work. Instead, she lived quietly beside him, maintaining independence. That independence puzzled Magnus. Many people in his world tried to benefit from proximity to power. Carly seemed uninterested in it. One evening, Magnus sat alone in his office reviewing quarterly revenue projections. But his attention drifted. Instead of focusing entirely on the numbers, he found himself thinking about Carly again. The quiet woman he believed he understood on their wedding day now appeared far more complex. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Magnus Peony began asking himself a question he had never considered before. Who was Carly Williams truly? Because the woman he married seemed very different from the person he thought he saw at the altar. Nearly 2 months had passed since the wedding. Life inside the penthouse had settled into quiet routines. Magnus continued managing the growing demands of Peony Systems, while Carly maintained her work at the Children's Foundation. Most evenings, Magnus returned home late. But one particular evening unfolded differently. A major investor meeting scheduled for the night had been postponed, unexpectedly. With several hours suddenly free, Magnus decided to return home earlier than usual. The car dropped him off at the tower just after sunset. When he entered the penthouse, something felt different. Soft music floated through the hallway. Magnus paused near the entrance. The sound came from the balcony. He walked slowly through the living room, following the music until the city lights came into view through the large glass doors. Outside, the Seattle skyline shimmered against the darkening sky. Boats moved slowly across Elliott Bay below, and standing near the balcony railing was Carly. Her back faced the door. Magnus stopped just inside the doorway. For a moment, he simply watched. The calm atmosphere felt completely different from the tense business meetings he had left behind earlier that day. Carly appeared relaxed, comfortable, and completely unaware that Magnus had returned home. Magnus stepped closer, intending to greet her. But as he approached, something caught his attention immediately. Something he had never seen before. The woman standing on the balcony looked different, completely different. Carly's thick glasses were gone. Her hair, usually tied into a tight style, now flowed freely across her shoulders. The evening breeze moved gently through the strands. The dull makeup Magnus had grown accustomed to seeing was gone as well. In its place was her natural complexion. Magnus stopped walking. The difference was striking. The quiet woman he believed he understood now stood before him with confidence and elegance he had never noticed. Her posture looked stronger. Her presence felt calmer yet more commanding. For a moment, Magnus wondered if he was even looking at the same person. Carly continued speaking softly into her phone, unaware that Magnus had stepped onto the balcony. "Yes, Maya, I'm proud of you," she said gently. Magnus listened quietly. "College is difficult for everyone at first," Carly continued. "Just stay focused." Her voice carried warmth and encouragement. After a few more moments, she ended the call and placed the phone on the table beside her. Only then did she sense movement behind her. Carly turned slowly, and Magnus saw her face clearly for the first time. His breath paused. The woman standing in front of him looked nothing like the person he had judged during their wedding ceremony. Her features appeared graceful and confident. Her eyes held steady calm. Magnus realized something immediately. He had been completely wrong. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Magnus struggled to organize his thoughts. The memory of their wedding day flashed through his mind. The oversized clothes, the heavy makeup, the thick glasses. Now those details felt like pieces of a puzzle he had misunderstood entirely. Carly watched his reaction quietly. She could see the confusion spreading across his face. Magnus finally spoke. "You look different." Carly raised one eyebrow slightly. "Different?" Magnus gestured vaguely. "The glasses, the makeup." Carly looked toward the balcony table where the glasses now rested. Then she returned her gaze to Magnus. "Yes," she said calmly, "those were intentional." Magnus felt his thoughts tighten. "Intentional?" Carly crossed her arms gently. "I wanted to observe something." Magnus's mind raced as he tried to understand. "What exactly were you observing?" he asked. Carly held his gaze steadily. "The kind of man I married." The words landed quietly but firmly. Magnus felt the meaning behind them immediately. Carly had not disguised herself because she lacked confidence. She had done it to test him. And the test had already produced its result. Carly stepped closer to the balcony railing. The city lights reflected softly across the water below. "When I agreed to the arrangement," she said calmly, "I knew almost nothing about you." Magnus listened without interrupting. "So I created a situation where I could observe your character." Magnus exhaled slowly. "You deliberately made yourself look less attractive." Carly nodded. "Yes." Magnus ran a hand through his hair. "And you did that on our wedding day?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Carly looked directly at him. "I wanted to see how you treated someone you believed had little value." The words struck deeper than Magnus expected. He remembered his reaction at the altar, the disappointment, the quiet judgment, the emotional distance that followed. Magnus lowered his gaze briefly. "So, I failed your test." Carly remained silent for a moment. Then she spoke carefully. "You judged me the moment you saw me." Magnus felt the truth settle heavily inside him. The confidence he normally carried in business negotiations felt strangely absent. For the first time in a long time, Magnus Pini faced a realization he could not ignore. His instincts had been wrong. Not about a financial decision, not about a corporate strategy, about a person. And standing before him now was the woman who had exposed that mistake without raising her voice or demanding attention. The quiet woman he dismissed weeks ago had just changed the way Magnus saw her. And more importantly, she had begun changing the way he saw himself. The balcony grew quiet after Carly spoke. Magnus remained standing near the glass doors, his thoughts moving quickly as he tried to process everything she had revealed. The evening wind carried the distant sounds of the city below, but neither of them moved. For weeks, Magnus believed he understood his wife. Now he realized he had never truly seen her at all. Carly watched him carefully. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused him with anger. Instead, she allowed the truth to settle naturally between them. Magnus finally spoke. "So from the beginning, you were watching me?" Carly nodded calmly. "I needed to understand who you were." Magnus looked toward the skyline. "You could have simply asked." Carly gave a small, thoughtful smile. "People often reveal more through their actions than through answers." Magnus understood the meaning immediately. During the wedding, during the weeks that followed, every reaction he showed had revealed something about him, and Carly had noticed every detail. Magnus turned back toward her. "And what exactly did you learn?" Carly did not hesitate. "You make decisions quickly." Magnus almost laughed. "That's hardly a surprise. But you judge quickly too," Carly added quietly. The statement landed with weight. Magnus knew she was right. His success in business came from quick analysis and decisive action, but those same habits had influenced the way he viewed people. And in Carly's case, those instincts had led him to the wrong conclusion. For the first time since their wedding day, Magnus felt something unfamiliar. Embarrassment, not because Carly exposed him publicly, but because she had quietly revealed a flaw he had never questioned before. Magnus leaned against the balcony railing. He studied Carly with new attention. Without the disguise, her confidence became impossible to ignore. Her posture carried calm strength. Her eyes held steady focus. Magnus realized something else. She had never needed his approval. "So tell me," Magnus said slowly, "after everything you observed, what did you decide?" Carly looked toward the water before answering. At first, I thought you were exactly what I expected. Magnus raised an eyebrow. And what was that? A man who values status more than people. Magnus felt the honesty in the statement. He could not deny that his actions had supported that conclusion. But then something changed, Carly continued. Magnus waited. You began noticing things about me. Magnus remembered the conversations, the financial reports, the quiet discussions on the balcony. You started asking questions instead of making assumptions. Magnus nodded slowly. And that improved my score on your test. Carly smiled slightly. It showed you were capable of learning. Magnus crossed his arms thoughtfully. That sounds like a very low compliment. Carly's voice remained calm. Growth always starts small. Magnus could not argue with that logic. For years he had focused entirely on expanding companies and markets. But personal growth had never been part of his priorities. Now Carly had forced him to face something he had avoided for most of his life, the limits of his own judgment. Magnus remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. I owe you an apology. The words came slower than most statements Magnus made. Carly looked at him but did not interrupt. I judged you during the ceremony, Magnus continued, and I treated this marriage like a contract. Carly listened calmly. Magnus exhaled quietly. I built my career by making quick decisions, but that habit clearly affected how I saw you. He paused briefly. And I was wrong. Carly studied his expression carefully. Apologies from powerful people often sounded rehearsed or strategic. Magnus's voice carried something different, uncertainty. I appreciate your honesty, Carly said. Magnus looked at her again. But honesty alone does not change trust, he added. Carly nodded. That's true. Magnus understood her meaning. Trust required time. Respect required consistency. And both of those things had been absent from their marriage so far. But Magnus felt something shifting inside him. For the first time since their wedding day, he wanted to understand Carly. Not as part of a legal arrangement, but as a person. The tension on the balcony slowly softened. Magnus rested his hands on the railing and looked toward the city again. I've spent years building companies, he said, but I realize now that I've ignored something equally important. Carly waited quietly. Understanding people, Magnus finished. Carly stepped closer beside him. That skill takes patience, Magnus nodded. I'm beginning to understand. For a moment, they simply stood there, watching the lights across Elliott Bay. Then Magnus spoke again. I would like to start over. Carly looked at him. Start over? Magnus nodded. Yes. He turned toward her fully, not as strangers completing a legal requirement, but as two people learning about each other properly. Carly considered the idea. She had not expected Magnus to change overnight, but his willingness to acknowledge his mistake mattered. Learning takes time, she said carefully. I understand. And patience. I understand that too. Carly gave a small nod. Then we can try. Magnus felt something unexpected in that moment. Relief. Not because the marriage requirement had been satisfied, but because the distance between them had finally begun to change. The test Carly designed had revealed Magnus's weakness, but it had also opened the door to something new, a chance to build something far more meaningful than the arrangement that brought them together: respect. After the conversation on the balcony, life inside the penthouse began to change in small but meaningful ways. Magnus did not attempt dramatic gestures. Instead, he started paying attention, noticing, learning. The next morning, Magnus left for work as usual. But before stepping into the elevator, he paused near the kitchen where Carly was preparing breakfast. Are you heading to the foundation today? He asked. Carly looked up from the counter. Yes. Magnus nodded. I'd like to visit sometime. The statement surprised her slightly. The children enjoy visitors, she said calmly. Magnus smiled faintly. I'll keep that in mind. The conversation lasted only a minute, yet it felt different from their earlier interactions. Before the balcony conversation, Magnus rarely initiated personal discussions. Now he asked questions, not out of obligation, out of interest. During the following weeks, Magnus also noticed something else. Carly's influence extended beyond the classrooms at the foundation. She spent evenings studying ways to improve funding stability for the non-profit programs. She reviewed financial strategies and explored partnerships that could help the foundation expand. One night, Magnus walked into the living room and saw Carly reviewing a spreadsheet of grant allocations. He looked over her shoulder briefly. "You've identified 3 funding gaps," he said. Carly nodded. "If they're solved, the after-school program could support nearly 40 more students." Magnus studied the numbers carefully. Her calculations were precise. "Well done," he said. It was a simple compliment, but Carly understood what it meant. For the first time since their wedding, Magnus was recognizing her abilities without hesitation. Several weeks later, Magnus attended a board meeting connected to the foundation. The meeting involved several wealthy donors discussing future investments in community education programs. Magnus rarely attended these sessions personally, but this time he wanted to observe something. Carly, during the meeting, one particular investor proposed redirecting part of the funding toward a new program managed by his own consulting firm. The proposal sounded impressive at first, but Carly's expression changed slightly as she studied the documents. After the investor finished speaking, Carly raised her hand politely. "May I ask a question?" The room grew quiet. Most people expected Carly to remain silent during high-level discussions. Instead, she spoke with calm clarity. "The projected cost structure in this proposal seems unusually high," she said. She pointed to a specific section of the report. "These administrative expenses appear to exceed standard non-profit ratios." The investor shifted slightly in his seat. "It's a specialized service," he replied. Carly did not raise her voice, but she continued presenting her analysis. She explained how the funding structure would reduce the number of children supported by the foundation programs. She showed alternative models that preserved more resources for education services. Magnus watched the discussion closely. Carly remained respectful but firm. Her reasoning was logical. Her numbers were accurate. By the end of the discussion, the board requested additional review before approving the proposal. The investor nodded politely, though his frustration was visible. Magnus realized something important. The quiet woman he once dismissed possessed both intelligence and courage, and she used both qualities to protect the programs she cared about. A few weeks later, Magnus attended a major corporate networking event in downtown Seattle. Executives from several technology companies gathered inside a large conference hall overlooking the waterfront. Rumors about Magnus's arranged marriage had already begun circulating within business circles. Many investors assumed the marriage existed purely for legal reasons. That evening, Magnus arrived with Carly. When they entered the hall, several executives turned with curiosity. Some whispered quietly among themselves. Magnus noticed the attention immediately. Instead of ignoring it, he addressed it directly. During a short speech about the company's future partnerships, Magnus paused briefly before finishing his remarks. "There is one more introduction I would like to make tonight," he said. The room grew quiet. Magnus gestured toward Carly. "This is my wife, Carly Peeney," he continued, speaking calmly. "She has helped me reconsider many things about leadership and responsibility." Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Magnus rarely spoke about personal matters during professional events, but his tone carried clear sincerity. "The work she does through the Children's Foundation reminds me that success should benefit more than just corporations," Magnus said. The room responded with polite applause. Carly stood beside him quietly. She never sought public attention, but she recognized something meaningful in that moment. Magnus had chosen to stand beside her openly, not because of legal obligations, because of respect. Later that night, Magnus and Carly returned to the penthouse. The city lights reflected softly across the water outside the balcony windows. Carly placed her purse on the table and turned toward Magnus. "You didn't have to say those things tonight," she said. Magnus loosened his tie slightly. "I meant them." Carly studied his expression. For someone who once preferred privacy, that was a public statement. Magnus smiled faintly. "I've spent years protecting my reputation," he said. but protecting something meaningful feels more important. Carly understood the difference. Magnus stepped closer to the window. "You've changed the way I evaluate people," he admitted. Carly leaned against the counter nearby. "That sounds like a significant adjustment for a CEO." Magnus nodded. "It is." He paused briefly. "But it's a good one." Carly watched him quietly. The distance that once defined their marriage had slowly disappeared. Not because of dramatic promises, but because of small actions: respect, honesty, patience. Magnus turned back toward her. "I know trust takes time," he said. Carly nodded. "It does." Magnus smiled slightly. "Then we have time." For the first time since their unusual wedding day, the marriage between Magnus and Carly no longer felt like a contract. It felt like the beginning of something real, something built not from obligation, but from understanding, respect, and the possibility of love that grows slowly, one honest step at a time. Several months passed. Seattle moved from the cool winds of early spring into a bright summer season. The city parks filled with families, and the children's foundation where Carly worked felt more alive than ever. That morning, Magnus parked his car outside the foundation building for the first time. He stepped out slowly, looking at the modest structure that had played such a large role in Carly's life long before he ever met her. From the outside, the building appeared simple. But as soon as Magnus stepped inside, the energy of the place became clear. Children's voices filled the hallway. Laughter echoed from the classrooms. Artwork decorated the walls, each drawing showing bright colors and hopeful messages written in uneven handwriting. Carly stood near a table surrounded by several children. She guided them through a reading exercise, helping one small boy sound out the difficult words in a storybook. "Take your time," she told him gently. "You're doing well." The boy tried again. This time, he read the sentence correctly. His smile grew wide with pride. Magnus watched quietly from the doorway. He had led major corporate meetings in skyscrapers across the country. He had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet the scene in front of him felt far more meaningful than a boardroom victory. Carly moved calmly between the children, helping each one with patience and attention. None of them cared about wealth. None of them cared about status. To them, Carly was simply the person who believed in them. Magnus finally understood something his grandfather had recognized long ago. Character reveals itself through actions. Conrad had chosen Carly because he knew she possessed something Magnus had spent years overlooking: integrity. Later that afternoon, Carly and Magnus walked through the small garden behind the foundation building. Flowers lined the stone pathway, and the soft sound of children playing echoed from the yard nearby. Magnus reached for Carly's hand. This time she did not hesitate. They walked slowly through the garden together. For a moment, Magnus looked at her with quiet reflection. Months earlier, he had formed an opinion about her in less than 10 seconds. He believed he understood everything he needed to know. But that moment had been built on assumption, not truth. Now Magnus understood the difference. He once judged her in a single glance. Now he understood the truth. Real beauty reveals character, courage, and heart, and the woman walking beside him possessed all three. Magnus paused near the end of the garden path. The afternoon sun rested softly across the flowers, while the sound of children playing drifted through the air behind them. He turned slightly toward Carly, then looked back toward the small building where the children were still laughing and running across the yard. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "There was a time when I believed success meant control. I believed power came from making fast decisions and moving forward without hesitation." Carly listened beside him. Magnus continued, "I built companies using that mindset. I studied numbers, markets, strategies. Every decision had one goal: win." He looked down at the pathway for a second. "But I ignored something important." He lifted his eyes again. "People." Magnus watched the children playing near the swings. These kids do not care about titles. They do not care about wealth or reputation. What they remember is who shows up for them, who listens to them, who believes in them, He turned toward Carly with a calm smile. You showed me something I had forgotten. Carly tilted her head slightly. What's that? Magnus answered without hesitation. That the most valuable thing a person can build is not a company. It is character. The wind moved gently through the trees around the garden. Magnus looked forward again, his voice steady. Some people spend their entire lives chasing success. Bigger houses, bigger deals, bigger numbers. He paused briefly. But none of those things matter if you lose the qualities that make you human. He looked toward the children once more. Respect matters, patience matters, kindness matters. Magnus turned back toward the camera of the moment, as if speaking to anyone listening. If someone ever judges you too quickly, do not let their opinion define your worth. Keep growing. Keep learning. Keep becoming the best version of yourself. He smiled softly. Because the people who judge the fastest often learn the slowest. Magnus gently squeezed Carly's hand. And one day, he said, the truth will reveal itself. Not through appearance, not through wealth, but through the way you live, the way you treat others, and the courage you show when life tests you. He looked at Carly with quiet gratitude. The world does not need more successful people. It needs more good ones. And sometimes the greatest lesson a person can learn comes from the one they almost overlooked.